Likutei Sichos, Chelek Chaf Aleph, Volume 21, the third Sicha of Parshas Va'era. This Sicha will explain the deep connection between the Haftorah and this week's Parsha. Also, it will bring out an amazing and very practical directive lesson for all of us that applies to our day-to-day life, especially as it concerns the attitude that we should have towards every single Jew. So to familiarize ourselves with some of the concepts that we mentioned in this Sicha, in order to help us flow through the Sicha more easy and better. So, first of all, what is the idea of Haftorah? We all come to Shul on Shabbos, we hear the Torah reading, we listen to a whole 7 aliyot of the Torah reading, and then following that, one person is designated with reading the Haftorah. What is the Haftorah? It is a segment from the prophets that is read as a supplement or as perhaps a epilogue to the Parsha. What is the origin of this? Where does this come from? Well, there was a time in our history when the Romans ruled over Israel, and they applied various decrees on us in order to stifle and to do away with our observance of Torah mitzvahs. And there was a time period, actually a very lengthy one, where it was forbidden to read the Torah publicly. Thus, imagine children who were born into that, growing up, had never seen the Torah being taken out of the ark in order to be read on Shabbos or Yom Tov. Therefore, the sages instituted, in order for this concept, this idea never to be forgotten, that they should read the Haftorah, which is they should read a segment from the prophets, which somewhat corresponds to the Parsha, and it should also mimic the Parsha, meaning remind us and be reminiscent of the Parsha. For example, on Shabbos, the rule is that the Haftorah has to be at least 21 verses. Why? Because on Shabbos we have 7 aliyot, 7 people are called up to the Torah, and the rule is that when you read the Torah, you cannot call up a person to read less than 3 verses. Thus, 7 times 3 is 21. Likewise, the amount of blessings that are recited over the Haftorah, both before and after, also total the amount, 7. Now, once the decree was abolished, was done away with, still the sages left this as part of the weekly reading. We first read the Torah and then we read the Haftorah. And of course, as we'll see in the Sicha, the rule is that the Haftorah has to correspond to the theme, to the main point of the Parsha, as will be elaborated in the Sicha. Another thing to be familiar with is the actual Haftorah of this week. The Haftorah is from the book of Yecheskel. The prophet over there says his prophecy on Mitzrayim and Parei. And he says that this Parei, who says, quote, "To me is my river, to me is my Nile, and I made it, or I made myself," meaning he denied the existence of Hashem, and he proclaimed himself as some kind of deity, and he was a very terrible and non-support for the Jewish people when they needed him, that the prophet says 2 things. First of all, that they will be destroyed, and they will be exiled for 40 years. After that, even when they return, they will never ever regain their original splendor. They will never ever come back to be a mighty kingdom. In fact, they were a very lowly kingdom as described in the prophecy. And after that, there's a second prophecy. This prophecy is directed towards Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, the same one who destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. That since he went ahead and he conquered a place called Tsor, which is in English Tyre, which is a very significant city in Lebanon, which was a problematic place for the Jewish people, for this Hashem will reward him and he will get to conquer Egypt and become a ruler over it. Another thing to be familiar with, which is something which is well known, we know that the word Torah, the title of this important book, the most important book, comes from the etymology of the word Hoyra'ah, which means a directive. The Torah is not telling us just stories or history. Rather, the Torah is teaching us how to live our life, what to do with our life, how to get closer to Hashem, and how to live a meaningful life. Another thing, we do mitzvahs. What is the etymology of the word mitzvah? Mitzvah means a commandment, but in Hebrew there are other words which mean commandment. It's explained that the word mitzvah, as it says in Kabbalah, mitzvah meloshoin safso v'chibur. It comes from the etymology of the word, which means to join together, to fuse together, to connect. When we do a mitzvah, we connect to Hashem. Another concept to be familiar with, to remind ourselves of, there are three types of mitzvahs: mishpatim, edus, and chukim. Mishpatim, of course, are those mitzvahs, those mitzvot which we have an appreciation of. Perhaps even if they weren't commanded to us by Hashem, we would have come to the very same conclusions on our own because they're logical, they're rational, they make sense. Eidos are testimonials, and chukim are those statutes which we don't have an understanding for. One final thing to be familiar with, the Bris Bin Avisarim, the covenant of the pieces. Way back, Avram Avinu was told that the Jews will be enslaved in Egypt. The Jews were not enslaved in Egypt because of some kind of sin that they committed or some wrongdoing. Rather, this was all pre-planned. This was all planned by Hashem. Hashem said that they're going to be in a strange land. They're going to be enslaved. They're going to be made to work very hard and even at great discomfort, or perhaps even you can call it torture. But afterwards, they will go out to be free with great possessions. Let's get into the Sikha itself. The Haftarah, as we know, has to always be me'inyan ha-parsha. It has to have the same theme, the same idea of the parsha. As we know, as we said in the introduction, that originally the Haftarah came in the place of the parsha. So it obviously had to represent the parsha to be somewhat reminiscent of it. Following this, we need to understand some of the things that appear in our Haftarah. You see, when you look in the Haftarah, you can say perhaps the first prophecy, somewhat connects to our parsha, because it's speaking about the defeat of and destruction of Egypt. Well, in our parsha, you have the bulk of the 10 makos, the 10 plagues, in which obviously Egypt was clearly destroyed. So perhaps you can say, there is some kind of correlation. However, what is the connection of the second prophecy regarding Nebuchadnezzar and the conquest of Tzoir, of Tyre in the Lebanon? How does that connect? And the reward that he gets for it, how does that connect to our parsha? Moreover, the fact, if you say, the point is that he was told as a reward, Hashem is going to allow him and give to him Egypt as a reward for that. Well, that still doesn't really connect our parsha. Because remember, in our parsha, Mitzrayim did not lose its sovereignty. Mitzrayim did not become totally destroyed and kingless or taken over by another nation. Rather, it was just smitten by all these plagues, but it was not taken away by another. So the question is, what is the connection? Says the Rebbe, the explanation is as follows. The idea, when we say that the Haftarah has to be the same theme of the parsha, it's not only in the events or the actual anecdotes of the events, but rather, and perhaps mainly, says the Rebbe, since the whole parsha, why do we read the parsha? Because the parsha is Torah. The Torah is Hayrah, right? We're reading it for the Hayrah aspect, for the aspect of the directives, the lessons that we're meant to learn that week. So it comes out that the Haftarah expresses the lesson, the main lesson of the parsha. Not so much necessarily the actual anecdotes, the actual details of the narrative, but rather the theme, the idea of what the parsha is there to impart on us in terms of directives of lessons on how to live our lives. Moreover, perhaps you can suggest that typically what appears in the Torah, in a great kitzur, in a very manner of synopsis, typically in the Nevi'im and the prophets, they're expressed and elaborated even more. And following this, perhaps we can suggest that the Haftarah not only connects to the general lesson, the general theme, Hayrah, of the Parsha, but rather that it brings it out even more. So following this, we can say that the second prophecy, that prophecy about Nebuchadnezzar getting his reward for following Hashem's will in conquering Tzoir, and he's going to get Mitzrayim, is not just another detail, but rather it's a detail and an outcome of the general. In other words, it fully expresses the general lesson of our Parsha. Let's go into it. What is that? So, Parshas Va'era comes as a continuation of the end of Parshas Shmos, when after Moshe and Aaron first approached Parai, what was his reaction? Parai went ahead and he ratcheted up the pain. He made it even worse. And he said, until now, I gave you straw. I provided you the resources from which to make the bricks that you're enslaved to make. Now I'm not going to give you even that. And the people came and complained to Moshe, said, what did you do to us? Now you made it even more difficult. Moshe comes to Hashem and says, Hashem, what gives? What is this all about? Why? Why did it become more difficult? And what does Hashem say to him? Yes, I remember the Jewish people and I see their terrible pain. Go tell them that I promised them. This is just a synopsis of what Hashem said. Go tell him that I'm going to certainly take them out of Mitzrayim. And here's where he says the four lishonos, the four expressions of Geula, of redemption. But of course the question can be asked, why didn't he give all these promises initially? When Moshe was still in Egypt, in Midian, before he came to Egypt, before he came to Mitzrayim, and Hashem says to him, go and redeem the Jewish people. He should have told them all this then, because, in other words, why did he wait? It seems that, at least the appearance is, that all these promises that Hashem has given now, and then the actions that come as a result, the 10 plagues and so on, are all being triggered by this extra hardship. But why? Why didn't you just said to him before, and then right away, Hashem should have just put it into action? Therefore, we must come to the conclusion that indeed, the full extent of the enslavement is what triggered and warranted these promises. Why? Because you see, we have to look at the real core of it, real point of the whole thing. What was really Golus Mitzrayim all about? In other words, what was really the reason for the enslavement? The answer is, it was a hachana. This was a preparation means for Matan Torah. Because what was the main thing? In other words, in order for Bnei Yisrael to be able to receive the Torah, they had to go through this process, this crushing process of the enslavement of Egypt. Now, what is one of the main things that was accomplished in Matan Torah? That is the actual performance of the mitzvah. That a person should do the mitzvahs. And a mitzvah is meloshin tzafsa v'chiba, meaning become connected to Hashem. He should do the mitzvah exclusively because this is the desire of Hashem. This is what Hashem wants. And this is not only in relation or in regards to the mitzvahs which are in the category of chukim, which a person needs to perform because there's no other way to perform it. You don't really understand what's behind it. But rather, perhaps even mainly, this applies to the mitzvahs which go into the category of mishpatim, which a person does have an understanding of. A person appreciates and perhaps even enjoys them. And here is what Matan Torah accomplished. Matan Torah made it so that a Yid does even those mitzvahs, even though he understands them. But he's doing it not because he understands it, not because he has a sense of appreciation of it, but rather because this is what Hashem wants him to do. This is exactly what Hashem wants. And likewise, also with learning Torah, not only the performance of mitzvahs, but the same as the learning Torah. Even though learning Torah, studying Torah really has to connect to one's understanding, has to connect to one's appreciation of things, because that's the whole mitzvah, to learn, to understand, to appreciate what's being said. But at the end of the day, you're not learning because you have that intellectual pleasure, that it stimulates your intellect, and that's why you're learning, but rather because this is what Hashem wants you to do. In order for Bnei Yisrael to be kelim, to be receptacles, so to speak, to be able to really receive this concept, to connect to this, to become one with this concept, they had to go through all the hardships of Golus. They had to go the hardships of this enslavement. And that's why it was already predicted already way back when Hashem was speaking to Avram. What is the idea behind it? The fact is, we see in reality that unfortunately when a person is going through Yisurim, when a person is going through very agonizing situations, the fact is that it actually breaks down the person's ego. It breaks down the arrogance of the person, and it makes him more humble. This bittul, this lack of arrogance, and this sense of subservience is what made the Yidden now receptive of the Torah. And of course, just like there had to be bittul by the Yidden, who were the actual ones to receive the Torah, the Bnei Yisrael, So too, in a more general sense, there had to also be this same effect of bittul in the world. Why? Because remember, the Torah wasn't just given exclusively to the Yidden, for the Yidden, but rather the Torah was given to Bnei Yisrael, to the Yidden, for them to affect the entire world. It was really given to the whole world too. Now, Parai was the supreme ruler of civilization at the time. And he was the most opposed to Matan Torah. As Parai was the epitome of arrogance, Tachlus Agaiva, to the extent, as it says in this week's Haftarah, that he said, Li yo'edi v'ani asisini, that this Nile is mine, and I made it. I'm the deity. I'm in charge of everything. That's why they had the Makkos. That's why they were smitten with all these 10 plagues, in order to bring them to crush their gaiva, in order to crush their arrogance. And where do we see it? Already towards the end of our parsha, we see that Parai exclaims, Hashem Hatzadik v'ani v'ami harishayim. He already makes a declaration that he's realizing, and he's becoming somewhat subservient, somewhat bittul, which represents the bittul of the world, that he says Hashem is the righteous one, and I and my people are the wicked ones. This idea that the klippa of Mitzrayim is what is menagid, what opposes Matan Torah, is expressed even more, even greater in the Haftarah. Because if you look closely in Haftarah, the Navi, the prophet Yechezkel, gives 2 reasons for why Mitzrayim is going to have the downfall. If you look in verse 6, it says, because that they were, quote, a staff of reed for Bnei Yisrael. What does that mean? Just like a reed is very soft. You can't lean on it. You lean on it, you fall over. Likewise, Bnei Yisrael relied on the help of Parai, the assistance of Parai, the military assistance of Parai, and protection, twice during the time of Sancheiriv, during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and they didn't protect him. They just weren't there for them. And then that's one reason he gives. But then in verse 8, in Pasuk Ches, he says, well, so says Hashem, that I am going to bring a sword over Parai. Why? Yan Omar, because he said, Li yo'edi v'ani asini, that to me is my Nile, and I'm the one who made it. I made myself. Now on the surface, it looks like these 2 reasons that the Navi gives are 2 separate ideas, are 2 unrelated concepts. Yet, the prophet connects the 2 by bringing them in close proximity. That tells us that from this we deduce that these 2 reasons are intertwined or connected, and in fact, one is a result of the other. So the Rebbe explains it. As discussed many times, also mishpatim, as we said before, the mitzvahs that fall into the category mishpatim, one is obligated to fulfill them not because you understand or you appreciate them, but as he said before, because so decreed Hashem. And by the way, this is the reason where we find that in the 10 Commandments, in the Aseret HaDibros, Hashem speaks about the loftiest things, but he also mentions things that are so obvious. Don't kill, don't steal, because it's telling us do it not because you understand that it's not a good thing to do, but do it because Hashem says it. Likewise, there's a connection between this idea that Parai was not there for the Jewish people. They were like a staff of reed, and that this was a result of, and not just that it's connected, it's actually a direct result of his tremendous arrogance that he had. And this idea connects to the Parsha. This is the idea of the Parsha. This is the whole theme of the Parsha. That the fact that Mitzrayim received the 10 Makkos, what does Hashem say? Number 1, V'yodu Mitzrayim kani Hashem. That through this they're going to know that I am Hashem. They're going to recognize that I am God. Number 2, Hashem says, as he said already in the Bris Ben Habesarim, in the Covenant of the Pieces, V'gam es hagoy asher yavodu dononoichi, that I'm going to give a punishment to the nation that's going to enslave them. Now if you think about it 1 second, why would they get punished, Parai, for enslaving the Jews? The fact is that this is what Hashem wanted. This is what Hashem decreed. So you should give them a reward, not a punishment. Why did they get punished so severely? The answer is, number 1, that they chose to do it. They weren't mandated by Hashem. They did it on their own bad choice. Number two, even worse, they did it in such a severe manner, even more than Hashem had told Avraham. They did it in such an inhumane manner. This came from what? This all is connected. This derives from their arrogance and their lack of belief in Hashem. So it's part and parcel. It's all connected. And this idea is enhanced in the Haftarah. Now, this idea that we need to observe the mitzvahs, because this is what Hashem told us to do, leads us to the obvious and very basic conclusion that Hamaisa hu Iker, that action, this is the main thing. In other words, the main objective is to actually perform the mitzvahs. The fact that they performed mitzvahs before Matan Torah, that was only in the realm of Nevraim. That wasn't the ultimate. And that therefore didn't reach the highest levels. And it was limited. However, after Matan Torah, when a Yid does the mitzvah, even if they don't fully understand it like Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov did, but the fact that this is the will of Hashem, we reach the highest point. In other words, this is coming b'koyach haboirei. And there we can understand now the connection, the deep connection to the reward that Nebuchadnezzar is receiving in the second part of the Nevuah, the connection to the beginning. Because remember, we said the beginning with Pareh, what was his idea? That he had his arrogance. And therefore he didn't believe in Hashem. They both went together, and therefore he did what he did. That he was a terrible tyrant when it came to the Jewish people in our parsha. You see, where do you see this idea? Nebuchadnezzar, why did he conquer Tsar? Why did he conquer Tyre? Not because Hashem told him, not because he was trying to be of service to Hashem. He had his own reasons to do it, whatever his reasons were. But the fact is, as we say, Ma'amaisa hu Iker, what he did was the will of Hashem. And since this is the will of Hashem, Hashem says he's going to get his reward. Because the bottom line is he did what Hashem wanted. Not necessarily that he was motivated by that, but what he did actually ends up being what Hashem wants. And this tells us that the ultimate, if you want to summarize the whole thing, that Maisa hu Hikar, that the action brings out everything. Says the Rebbe, from here you have a tremendous lesson. When a Yid does you a favor, someone does a favor for another, you need to be appreciative. You need to acknowledge it and be appreciated. Even though you can make the argument, maybe that Yid didn't do what he did for me. It wasn't directed to me. I happen to benefit from it. But who says that Yid did what they did to benefit me? So why should I give him thanks? Perhaps he was just doing something for his own purpose. And by the way, I was benefited from it. We learn from the Haftarah that even Nebuchadnezzar, who not maybe, but certainly did what he did for his own reasons, for his own motivations, and yet Hashem says he should receive his reward, how much more so a Yid? That a Yid by definition is one who has a good heart. Yid nagoim lechasadim. So certainly what he did, even though perhaps he intended primarily himself, but he also did me the favor, and I have to be thankful. He says the Rebbe, this can help us appreciate even more a famous saying of the Baal Shem Tov, that Amis Yisrael is to love a Jew, even a Jew that you never met. What does that mean? A Jew who lives in the other end of the world that I never met, how am I supposed to love him? Says the Rebbe, because if that Yid does a mitzvah, the Yid is living at the other end of the world, I'll never meet him in my life. What's my connection to that Yid? That Yid does a mitzvah. And in fact, says the Rebbe, this is not just a Yid who's shomer Torah mitzvahs, but even a Yid who on the surface doesn't seem to be an observant Jew. But the fact is, we know that every Yid is maldi mitzvahs karim, and every Yid is full of mitzvahs like a pomegranate is full of seeds, and that's the actual fruit. So a Yid does a mitzvah, and as the Rambam tells us, every good deed enhances the world. So therefore, when he did his mitzvah, he enhanced the world. Whose world is it? I live in that world. You live in that world. He enhanced my world. Since he enhanced my world, then of course I have to love him, because he did me a favor, even though he doesn't know who I am. And he did it for whatever motives he did it at the time and where he is. But the fact that it benefited me, I need to be thankful for it. And the expression of this thanks, it comes in the form of Avos Yisrael, like the Baal Shem Tov says, to each and every Jew, even to one you've never met.